Assalamu alaikum everyone. I hope you're all well. So today we are going to learn how to answer a 3 mark question properly in a business exam, especially the common explain one type of questions. Right? So whenever you encounter a question in paper 1 which is an explain statement. So the key word in this kind of a question is an explain question. Right? So you find it in your 1B, 2B and 3B. So there would be 3 mark questions tested in your paper 1 exam. And today we're going to look at what are the common mistakes that people make. We're going to look at some sample scripts as to how you're supposed to write an answer for this. Right? So these questions look short and easy, but many students lose marks because they don't understand what the examiners really want in this. Right? So let's begin. So the first thing is to understand the standard structure of the question. A 3 mark question usually follows a kind of a structure which is it may ask you explain one factor. Now, that factor could be a benefit, a limitation, a method of doing something, perhaps. For example, the question may be phrased as explain one method of recruitment or one method of training the workers. You can also encounter a question of one reason. For example, explain one reason why a business may go for cost plus pricing. Right. So this is the standard structure. So whenever you see questions like this, you should immediately recognize that the examiner is asking for one clear point explained with a business context. Now, for that, you need to understand what the marking scheme is about and what are the exact marks requirement. So if you look at the marks division, so there is 1 mark for knowledge and 2 marks for application. Right. So for these 3 marks, you should always have this marking scheme in your mind because this is the one thing that would guide how to write an answer. So there is 1 mark for knowledge. Knowledge comes from stating the factor. And then there are 2 marks for application, and application is then further divided into two parts, which is limited application and developed application. So this means that one simple business point as you would not be enough. You would need to show the point in a real business situation and develop that situation further. So the easiest way to write an answer for this question is a three-sentence structure, right? So the first sentence would be that you would state the factor directly. For instance, if the question asks you explain one advantage of induction training, you won't start with defining the term. Now, this is one of the things, one of the problems that students do in their exams, and that is that they start defining the term. The examiner does not expect you to define it, neither there are marks for definition there. Right? So don't waste time giving textbook definitions in in a 3 mark question. And if the question says explain one advantage, then start with the advantage right away. And then once your first sentence is complete, when you've clearly stated an advantage, then apply it to a business context, right? You can use examples like hypothetical examples like cafe, hotel, a clothing business, perhaps a bakery, a factory, perhaps a smartphone company, or you can, if the question involves some numericals, you can show them some working there as well, right? So you can use other suitable businesses and you can apply that to that particular situation. So that's the second sentence, and the third sentence would be, okay, don't just mention the context there. You need, this is the most important part. Okay, you need to explain what happens in that context and why that helps or harms the business, right? So the pattern is pretty simple. When you're encountering this, you start with the point, you go to the context, and then you go to the development, right? So understand this is as in this way, right? So the patterns, now that we have this in mind, now that we have the pattern in perspective, we can now move on to discussing what are the common mistakes that you do and what are the things that you need to avoid, right? So one of the common mistakes is that you waste time on definition. So if the question says explain, you start defining, you're basically wasting valuable time in your exams, which is essentially um wasting it, right? So you don't need to waste that valuable time. You need to utilize it well. The examiner already gave you the term in the question. Your job is not to repeat it. Your job is to explain one point clearly, right? The second mistake that students do is that they don't give context, right? So some students would give a business point, but they would keep it too general. For example, if the question is, okay, explain one disadvantage to the business of having CSR, they may just write CSR increases costs and just stop there and do nothing about it. Now, this shows some knowledge, so you get a mark for that. But where is the business? What kind of firm? How do costs rise? What is the situation, right? So without a context, the answer stays weak and you're not able to access those application marks which are there. And lastly, another mistake that students do, that some students do end up giving a context, but they don't develop it. They would mention that a factory or a cafe, but they stop there and they don't explain it, develop the point further. So let's look at some samplers, right? So these are from the May June 2025 paper, and these are from the real exam scripts which the examiners have checked, right? So the question here is, explain one disadvantage to the business of having corporate social responsibility as a business. Now notice the pattern that's in front. You can notice that there is no definition. The student has started directly to the point. He has come straight to the point. He scored a 3 out of 3 because it does all the 3 points things properly, right? So the student starts with identifying identifying the disadvantage clearly. He says that by having CSR as its main objective, a business will have to face higher costs, right? So this part is the knowledge. Secondly, he applies it to the business context where he says, for example, a manufacturer producing chemicals which used to throw waste into rivers now will have to use environmentally safe ways, right? So when he give this kind of a thing, this is now this the first limited application part. So this is the second mark that he gets for limited application. And third, he then develops the context by explaining that the firm may now need to move to safer methods of waste disposal, and possibly which is expensive, which would require expensive waste treatment. And this final part is very important. This shows exactly why CSR increases costs. And therefore, for this last, this is the development of the application. And the student got a 3 out of 3 in his exam, right? So the full marks is very realistic in the papers. You just need to know how accurate, how to write, and you can clearly see that the student hasn't written a very long answer, right? Let's move on to the second sampler question. Now this is again from the same paper. It says that explain one way a business could use employee development to encourage multi-skilling, right? So this answer also scored a 3 out of 3, and you can clearly see what the student did. He didn't define it. He multi-scaling, he went straight to the point. He said one way a business could use employee development to encourage multi-skilling is through job rotation. Now job rotation is the knowledge point, right? He then moves on to apply it to the business context. He says that in the case of something like a toothpaste company, right? So he says, for example, if in a toothpaste manufacturing company, an employee initially filled tubes with toothpaste will also be at another time packing the tubes into small boxes, right? So this is the context. This is limited application. And then when he develops it further, when he says, okay, this will create a new job for the employee, hence encouraging multi-skilling. Then he develops the point by explaining how the worker who normally does one task can be moved to another stage of production, allowing him to learn different roles. So the answer is not just saying that job rotation helps multi-skilling, it's actually showing how it works inside the business. And that development is what earns him the higher marks, right? Let's look at a few more samples so that you guys understand it well. So in the third sample, you can see it's the question was explain one way a business could reduce variable costs. Again, this answer works because he identifies one way clearly and then applies it. So the student says that a business could reduce the costs of material used in production. He then gives an example. So he categorically states that a business may reduce variable cost by decreasing the cost of materials. So this is the knowledge point. He then says, for example, a business may choose to swap organic cotton for polyester. That's the limited application. And then explaining to reduce the variable cost when producing their products. It basically shows that it's practical, right? So remember, another thing which you can see from these scripts is that the examiner is not looking for any fancy language. The examiner is looking for a clear idea, a relevant business example, and an explanation of the impact, right? One of the common mistakes which we identified was no application, which you can see from this. The student wrote something like that CSR may distract the business from its goals and aims, which was the question that we previously discussed. We needed to talk about one disadvantage to the business of having CSR. So the so this answer got 1 mark. Why one? Because the student has given a general point. There is knowledge there, but there is no business context at all. No example, no application, no development. So this is a very important lesson that you guys need to learn from this script, is that a correct point on its own is usually only getting you 1 mark, right? Without development, without application, you cannot get a 3 out of 3. So you must always put your answer in a business context, right? And lastly, if you look at the last question, that is, okay, explain one advantage to the business. So the question was, explain one advantage to the business of holding buffer stock. So the student's idea was basically that buffer stocks help when stocks are low and when emergency happens. So emergency arises, and financial danger is something that's a context. So he gets a 2 out of 3 because there is some context there, because the idea is there and there is some attempt to apply it, but application is not developed properly. So words like emergency and financial danger are quite vague, and the answer does not explain a clear business scenario, right? So for full marks, the student should link it to a specific business and explain what happens. So if I were to write an improved version of this, I would go something like this. I would say one advantage to the business of buffer stocks is that it helps business to continue operating if suppliers delay the supplies. So see, this is the first line which gets me my knowledge point, right? What I do next is I say, for example, and I now need to link it with an example. I say, for example, if a bakery flour delivery arrives late, they can use the extra stock to keep producing bread, right? So this is application level 1. And now I need to explain the impact. So I'll say this avoids lost sales and helps maintaining customer satisfaction. And that's my developed application. And yet again, this is now much better because the first sentence gives the advantage, it clearly states the point. The second sentence gives the business context, and the third sentence develops the impact. And that's exactly what a 3 mark answer needs to look like. So, the final rule that you need to remember is whenever you answer in the exams, ask yourself these 3 questions. Have I stated one factor clearly? Have I linked it with a business example? Have I developed the context around it? If the answer to all these 3 questions is yes, you are much closer to getting full marks. So, the big lesson from this is for any 3 mark question, don't just write the correct point, write the correct point in context and develop it. I'll see you in the next video. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.